The scratching woke me up again. It was not the seat belt or the tire rubbing. It was a tiny, patient scrabble right beside my ear where my head rested against the leather of the old steering wheel I kept in my room. I sat up in the dark, and the wheel glowed faintly where moonlight hit the grain, pale as a knuckled hand. The sound was precise, like nails on varnish. It had been there every night for a week, always at the same minute between 2 and 3, like a clock that forgot how to tell time and learned to plead instead. I live in a narrow house on the edge of town, where the gated mansions thin into service roads and the rain smells of oil and cut grass. My job is specific and discreet. I guide them through private preserves, through abandoned factories, through stretches of forest where the rich go because they want the thrill of the chase without consequence. I wear a suit that no one really notices, and I drive the routes no one maps. I am the one who knows where the fences are low and where the old quarry will swallow a sound. For years, the work paid well enough to stop me asking moral questions at night. The steering wheel had been a piece of old equipment from a collector, a prize I told myself I bought for nostalgia, because the wood fit around my palms the same way a familiar face fits behind your ribs. The wheel itself is wrong in ways you can list like an inventory, and in ways that do not make sense until you touch it. Visually, it is pale, like bone washed clean in sunlight, the grain forming faint lines that curve like lips. To the touch, it is almost humid, a temperature like the underside of a coin freshly taken from a pocket. Up close, the smell is metallic, like a drawer of old keys, and the coppery tang you notice when someone has been handling tools. When the light catches it, an inner sheen seems to move beneath the surface, a slow ripple like breathing lacquer. I pressed my thumb to one of the curls of grain and felt a small vibration, an impatient tick that traveled under my skin as if testing the pulse of my hand. It did not feel like folklore, it felt like instruction. I do not like to be seen as guilty. I tell myself I am a guide, a conduit, a driver of routes and habits. I have names for the roads I drive and prices I do not quote aloud. I tell my clients directions and they hand me envelopes. I keep my conscience folded into the glove compartment where receipts and dog-eared maps accumulate. Still, there is something in me that recognizes a teacher when it waits for me on my bed. The wheel did not want to be caged in the back of my van anymore. It wanted out, and it wanted me to move. 3 weeks before the scratching started, I met Elena at a private sale in a warehouse with no windows. Elena cleans antique faces and gives them new places to occupy. She sold me the wheel with a smile that knew too much, and with hands stained a dull green from polishing brass. She called it a relic from a driving school for the wealthy that closed in the 70s. She said it was charismatic in a jocular way. I paid more than I should have. Jonah, my mechanic, said I was soft. Jonah has spent his life with machines that do not ask for stories. He and I argued about mileage and torque, and then about men who think they can buy experience. He laughed when I told him I had bought the wheel because it looked like a hand. He said hands were for holding wrenches, not destinies. I did not tell him that a week after I brought the wheel home, Mr. Whitman flew in and demanded a route unlike any I had ever planned. Mr. Whitman is tall and pale and always smells faintly of peppermint. He likes hunting with company and with witnesses. Sylvia likes the view and the 10-minute adrenaline after the kill. Carla organizes their schedules and their alibis. Lucas brings the dogs. Maya watches from the hilltops and takes notes. The first night I took Mr. Whitman and Sylvia out with my old van, I felt the wheel hum when I slid my hands onto it. It was a low vibration that matched the engine, and then that vibration shifted, and the van seemed to know where the gravel was thin and where the hunter would most likely trip. I did not trust it at first. I kept my hands loose, as if an old steering wheel could be the only temptation. Between the trees, we spoke in the small way professionals do. Here is the dialogue that matters, because it is the language I learned to answer in when something other than the map began to speak. Mr. Whitman said, "Are you sure about this route?" I said, "It has been safe for years." Sylvia asked, "What about witnesses?" I said, "We will leave no signs." Carla said, "You always say that." Mr. Whitman said, "That is why we hire you." Sylvia said, "Keep it quick." I said, "I will." That exchange was 6 lines, and the wheel answered in the corners of my palms, and in the way the van rolled, as if it had its own idea of a shortcut. The wheel seemed to teach me subtle curvatures of road that were not on any satellite. It pointed with a friction that meant something like "trust me" or like "obey." Once I let it guide, the hunt moved cleaner. The quarry became ways of moving light, and the clients became less like people and more like clock. Hands. Predictable. Valued. Expendable. I have always been a good liar about my moral arithmetic. But secrets multiply when you keep them in your pockets. The town has people who know the edges of what we do. Officer Reyes knows how to look at tire tracks and at the way a fence bends when someone lifts it. Lucas helps set up trips and grooms the dogs that the super rich bring, and Lucas always kept his mouth shut. Elena, the seller. Jonah, the mechanic. Carla, the organizer. Sylvia, the client. Mr. Whitman. Maya, the lookout. Officer Reyes. Lucas. These people form a circle that does not stare inward enough. They are names and reactions and small movements of the world that should have kept me from slipping. At the point where the wheel started giving me more than routes, I went back to Elena and asked what she had not told me. She touched the wood and her fingers trembled, the way someone touches a wound that is not theirs, but that remembers their name. Her voice was careful. Elena said, "It knows roads," I said. "Roads are not knowing," Elena said. "Things keep memory," I said. "You sold it to me for money," Elena said. "Money asks no questions." That dialogue stretched longer in my head than the spoken words. Elena handed me an old clipping with photographs spliced together, the sort of thing a private collector keeps nailed to a cupboard door. The clipping showed a driving academy where men in suits practice steering through simulated streets. A caption mentioned a scandal and the word "closed" with no explanation. The smell of the clipping was like attic dust and tobacco, and it carried with it the suggestion that hands had once been trained there to close and to direct not only machines, but people. That was the first time I noticed how much the wheel wanted me to read. My notebooks filled with coordinates and with descriptions of how the wheel reacted to different surfaces. I began sleeping in the van on nights I did not drive. The wheel made sounds that were not meant for others at first. It made a short scratch when it wanted me to turn left, and a long rasp when it wanted me to wait. These noises looped inside my skull like a litany. Repetition became a religion. Repetition made a plan. If you were with me the night things escalated, you would have heard the rasping at the old quarry. The air tasted of iron and clay. The wheel wanted a path through the stones, and I followed. At the quarry edge we argued aloud, because that is what people do when they try to stay human in the face of instruction. The dialogue that night was longer, because the stakes were higher and because the wheel had learned to listen. Mr. Whitman said, "Move the van closer to the pit." I said, "We will lose cover if we—" "Get too close," Sylvia said. "You always find the worst places." I said, "I know these sides like the backs of my hands." Carla said, "Are you nervous?" I said, "I am just careful." Mr. Whitman said, "We paid for confidence, not care." Sylvia said, "Do it." I said, "Fine, we will do it your way." The argument was 8 lines. The wheel did not argue. The wheel tightened in my palms, and the van obeyed a route that left the quarry like a mouth and took the night into its teeth. In the aftermath, when the clients left satisfied and their laughter rang hollow against the hood, I sat with the wheel in my lap and thought of all the small bargains we keep with objects. The wheel had taught me not only roads, but the architecture of temptation, the invisible ledges where pride falls. The object wanted to be used and also to be needed. It wanted me to need it as a person needs a guide to fear. I inserted here a pause to ask you something. If you were woken at 3 in the morning by a sound beside your bed that sounded like nails on varnish and found an object that seemed to know where the fences in your life sag, what would you do? Would you hide it in the trunk of a borrowed car and never speak of it again? Would you throw it in the river and make sure no one told you if it resurfaced? Or would you keep it because it promised you power in exchange for small obedience? Tell me which object in your house you think could come alive and what it would ask of you. Start your comment with "My object would be," so I can find the stories that matter. The best answers will be read in the next episode and will help build a collective map of what wakes people in the night. Your experience matters. It gives this work a pulse that my paperwork cannot. After I put that question out to the world and wrote it into my notebook, the scratches under my skin worsened. The wheel learned new sounds. It made a fluttering like a moth trapped in a glove. It made the sound of an old business card being slid across varnish. I began to hear the wheel when I was not near it. That is the sign of obsession. You start to hear qualities of the thing in the creaks of your house and in the clink of a spoon. There are moments of tension that stretched time thin and taught me the language of wanting. One such moment is the night I tried to leave it in a locker at Jonah's garage. The locker smelled of oil and old tea. I closed the door and walked away, thinking that distance would dull the wheel's voice. I got halfway down the block and heard a sound like something knocking inside a chest. I turned back and found the locker door ajar and the wheel sitting on my bench as if it had never left. The metal latch had not been forced. The leather bench had not been moved. For 5 minutes I sat on the curb and listened to the wheel's tiny, impatient scratches as if they were a confession. I wanted to scream at it and at myself. That night I learned that some objects do not accept exile. Another tense moment came when Officer Reyes stopped my van for taillight issues. He had a notebook and a quiet way of asking questions that are traps. He asked if I had been in the quarry the night before. I answered in the practice of professionals. The wheel sat between my legs and hummed low. The officer leaned in as if to smell my fear. For a long breath he studied the grain, and then he asked if I had bought the wheel somewhere new. I told him I had found it at a private sale. He nodded and said, "Keep it clean." He wrote nothing. He drove away. Later I realized his silence was its own verdict. There was a final tension that lasted like a slow fever. The clients wanted a new hunt, one that required me to instruct the prey, to box them into a place where the rich could pursue them like a sport. The planning was technical. The wheel taught me which gates were left unlocked during third shift, and how to time a generator's throb to mask footfalls. The process became ritual. I measured distances and rehearsed routes and made lists in a voice that tried to be clinical. I told myself I was creating a service, a trade, a necessity. I could not see the trap beneath the ledger. At this point, more people appear on the page and in room. Carla started bringing lunches and propping open doors. Lucas began to look at me with something like pity and something like calculation. Maya, who watches from the hilltops, left a note that read, "Be careful with what shows you the way," in which she meant both the wheel and me. Jonah refused to touch the wood after the locker incident. Officer Reyes visited the quarry and came home with hands that smelled of clay. Elena stopped returning my calls, and when she did, she spoke quickly as if to avoid stories. Mr. Whitman brought new names. Sylvia brought silence. Sylvia's quiet annoyed me most because it felt like a folded accusation. There was research to be done because patterns need context. I dug through the clipping Elena gave me and found mentions of a man named Alastair Crane who ran a driving program that doubled as something else. I spoke with a retired instructor named Harold who remembered a room where collectors practiced cornering more than control. I typed notes and smelled the attic paper and the cloth. Nicotine that ghosts of archives leave behind. Harold said, people learned to guide and to hunt at once, and they kept lists. He said names were currency. He named 3 men who had disappeared in the 70s, and a scandal the papers never fully explained. The town library had archives stamped with dust. I found a photograph with the wheel in the corner of a room where a woman looked at the camera as if asking for help and as if she had been promised she would be found. When the reveal of history came, it felt less like discovery and more like recognition. The wheel was a surviving instrument of coaching hands to guide more than cars. It had been used to train men to read movement and to direct others through terrain. That history sat like a stone in my throat, heavy and imprecise. I read a clipping that quoted an old report mentioning a phrase that made my hands sweat: cagedriver. The word meant one who directs animals or people into pens. The wheel had once been part of a system that taught people to steer other people. I tried to stop. I tried to dump the wheel in the river that runs behind town. I wrapped it in oilcloth and fed it to the back of my van and drove until the road blurred and the neon of the town slipped into one long smear. I thought that distance would be a remedy. I let the clients go on without me once, and they found a substitute. The hunts continued. The wheel was patient. It wanted me because it taught better when the hands that learned were mine. It wanted me because it preferred teaching someone who could feel the grain as an instruction rather than an object. There is a technical element I have to describe because the process of using the wheel became a ritual that required specific motions. In brief, the method is this. You cradle the wheel low and feel for variance in the wood. When the brain tightens under your fingers, you stop and listen. You mark the spot in your memory, and you measure the footfall of the van against the fence posts. You practice coaxing the vehicle into a lull and then into a sudden correction that a human chasing will mistake for panic. You use the sound of the engine to cover your footfall, and you time turns to create choke points. You never look at the quarry straight on. You learn to read the open space by the way wind moves through grasses. The technique is surgical, and it asks for bodies in ways you cannot calculate. It took me 213 repetitions to feel it in my bones, and one night too many to understand what I had become. The crisis arrived as crises do, in a combination of pride and small betrayals. Lucas flirted with an outside handler who promised a better split for quieter work. He took a map and sold a waypoint. Mr. Whitman asked for a spectacle and added more guests to his circle. Carla hesitated at a door, and that hesitation is the kind of thing wealth cannot tolerate because it reveals that someone is thinking. The wheel pushed harder, making the van's steering claim a more aggressive angle. I felt the wood as if it were a throat tightening. I knew then that the wheel not only guided me physically, but was teaching me to think like it wanted. It taught me the economy of routes and of silence. There were decisions that night that took minutes but felt like the length of a life. I could have driven away. I could have turned the wheel over to the police. Instead, I let it instruct me exactly where to stop and when to open the gate. The quarry mouth swallowed a shape, and the laughter that followed tasted like the ashes of something lost. I felt different in my hands. The wheel had not only educated my palms, but rewired something in my head. I began to catalog the smell of fear in ways I had only cataloged engine smells before. The transformation was granular and then total. After the event, a rumor spread through the smaller circles that do not intersect with power. Maya wrote an email to a local reporter who kept a private feed for oddities. The reporter, Sylvia's brother, wrote a piece that hinted at impropriety without naming names. Officer Reyes made a note in his notebook that might be used one day. Elena stopped selling to people like me. Jonah refused to fix anything that smelled of the wheel. Carla took a job abroad, and Mr. Whitman bought a newer toy that made less noise. Lucas skipped town. I kept the wheel, and it kept teaching me. I kept the lessons because they felt like nourishment and like chains at once. 1 month later, my life had the awkward normality of people returning from a war zone and pretending to sleep in regular beds. The local bakery where Paula works whispered that customers were avoiding the road by the quarry. Paula brought me bread one morning and said I should consider leaving town. I thanked her and ate the bread while the wheel sat on my table like an offered promise. Officer Reyes came by to ask if I had seen any unfamiliar trucks. He mentioned the name of a man who had disappeared, and I felt an old chill. Maya called and left one sentence on my answering machine: "Be careful with what tells you the way," which felt less like advice and more like a benediction. The neighborhood had shifted infinitesimally. Elena's silence became an absence you could measure. 3 months in, the change hardened. A local pastor named Father Mateo began receiving more parishioners who spoke in hushed confessions about being followed. The town's newspaper printed a small column written by the reporter who had been tipped off. He named the driving school from the clipping and hinted at patterns. Mr. Whitman's social circle muttered about discretion. Sylvia stopped coming around to the gatherings where trophies were shown. Jonah refused to touch my van and left me a box of parts with a note that read, "Clean your hands." Carla called from abroad and asked if I was all right. My answer was a long silence followed by small lies. My name began to appear in rumor boards as someone to avoid. The wheel's scratches became less private. The sound was public now, or at least the knowledge that the wheel made such a sound was. 6 months later, the town had settled into a new geometry. There were people who would not cross the bridge near the quarry after dusk. Officer Reyes had been promoted, which made him less available for small inquiries and more likely to file reports that go unread. The reporter came back with a piece that led to a small investigative committee and to a hearing that mentioned the word Cagedriver without fully explaining who had trained whom. Elena stood up in a meeting and said she had once sold a number of wheels to men who wanted to learn to push others, and that some of those men had disappeared. The council named me at the hearing only once, and then the cameras left. Mr. Whitman's estate moved their gatherings to another town. Carla returned but kept her distance. Lucas's name surfaced on a list that suggested he had left with money and a new identity. Paula baked bread and handed it to me across the counter with the careful look of someone giving a bandage. I do not pretend to have an ending that feels like absolution. The wheel still sits in my living room. It scratches at night in the way that old loyalties do. It has taught me to anticipate fences and to think in choke points. It has taught me to listen for the small betrayals that make a plan. It has trained me to be careful with doors and louder with the decisions I make. I am quieter in some ways and louder in others. I am a man who knows how to guide the super-rich and how to make a quarry seem like a maze. I am also a man whose hands have been taught to coax and to command human movement as if it were a gear in a machine. If you ask me whether the wheel made me do it, I will answer with the language I learned in the van and the ambiguity of men who take payment. The object taught me and demanded reciprocity. I became, slowly and then quickly, a cage driver. The community reacted. Elena no longer meets private clients. Jonah rebuilt the garage door that had rattled that night and carved his hands. Work. Paula stopped delivering bread to certain roads. Officer Reyes keeps watch but writes slowly. Carla works abroad and speaks to me cautiously. Maya watches from the hills and emails coordinates that are a map of small mercies. Do not imagine that confession erases consequence. My name is in half-forgotten minutes and in the dust that catches on the wheel's paler grain. If you ever feel an object in your home breathe in the same rhythm as your doubts, be careful what you learn from it. Objects teach us because we let them. They teach us because we need someone to point the way when we have decided we are too tired to choose. If you came this far, then know that I am telling you as honestly as I can what I have seen and what I have become. I do not sleep as well as I did. I wake to scratches that sound like appointments. I drive routes that are precise and shaped by the memory of faces. I hold the wheel and feel it like a second heart. It is calm most days. It is patient. It scratches in the small hours and asks nothing more of me than attention and obedience and the occasional motion that saves the work.
I have lost some of the people I loved to the empty spaces that follow such choices, and I have gained a craft that is both service and sentence. If you want to hear more about objects that teach and about the people who forget how to refuse, stay and listen. If you have an object you think might answer you back, start your comment as "My object would be" and tell me what it would ask. I read everything. Some of your replies will shape what I pick up next and will become part of a ledger I keep, like one keeps receipts from a life one is still trying to account for.